Mr. Bees, Mr. Bees, Mr. Bees, history. Now then, people, today as we go through our preparation for our AQA GCSE examination, we're going to look at the Germany paper and we're going to focus in on young people in Nazi Germany. So let's get going. One of the first things that the Nazis did when they came to power was to control schools in Germany. They did that through three ways. Firstly, all teachers had to be part of the Nazi Teachers Association, sort of teachers union. They had to be vetted for their suitability. And, within 3 years of Hitler coming to power, 97% of all teachers were members in public schools, meaning that those people would willingly teach what the Nazis told them to. Textbooks were rewritten, especially in history and biology, to give the Nazi view of history about their Aryan superiority and about other groups' inferiority, and these messages were often sent in storybooks. So here's a picture of a storybook, an anti-Semitic storybook here, where it says, "Trust no fox on his green heath and no Jew on his oath." So both in schools formally and in wider literature, German young people were being brainwashed. This continued with the formal curriculum, often 2 hours of PE a day, lots of subjects which helped young boys become fit and ready to fight and believers in Nazi ideology. Girls studied primary home economics, PE, how to be a good mother. But even maths questions were tilted in such a way as to try and provide some sort of Nazi brainwashing. So here's an example of it costs a mentally ill person this much money, there are this many people ill, how many brackets proper Germans could get 1,000 Reichsmarks loan from this money, i.e. if we got rid of the mentally ill people. So maths questions were used to try and further the Nazi cause. But of course it wasn't for everybody. Jewish children were initially humiliated, as you may well understand, in some of the lessons and in some of the books. And in 1938 they were formally banned from education. Okay, so that's schooling. Let's move on now to look at young people's leisure time. So what the Nazis did is, as you will probably know very well already, they set up a number of different official youth organisations, ranging from the age 6 up to the age of 18. The most famous ones being the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls or German Maidens. These are the sort of things that these separate groups, the boys and the girls, got up to, preparing the young men for fighting and preparing the young women for housework and motherhood. There's a delightful picture of some German maidens in training as part of their leisure time. Remember, it is what they do when they're not at school. So when the Nazis came to power, about 100,000 people were members of these official Nazi youth organisations. This has increased 2 million within a year of Hitler coming to power. It became compulsory, membership became compulsory in 1936, and implied in that is all other groups were therefore illegal. So Boy Scouts were banned, Catholic youth group also made illegal. So much so that by 1940 about 82% of all German young people were members. However, bear in mind that means that about 18% were not. So that's how they tried to control young people's leisure time, in addition to what we've seen already about schooling. Okay, we're going to move on now and look, rather than the official Nazi controlled education and youth organisations is how they treated Jewish people and how Jewish young people responded. I like to show this picture. I think this picture is of a girl called Berta. She's a Jewish girl, and there's a tradition in Germany, I think still goes on to this day, that when you start your first day of school, you get a school cone full of candy. Now, the reason I put this on here, now clearly many Jewish people did face discrimination before the Nazis got to power, but I think it's symbolic that largely before 1933, many Jewish people lived a perfectly normal life in Germany, as Berta perhaps shows. But as we've seen earlier, they were humiliated in school, both in lessons and in books. They were excluded from all the organisations. You were not allowed to be a member of the Hitler Youth or a German Maiden, and then you're excluded from schools. Now, one of the things I found out when doing a bit more digging in this topic for this video was that initially, when Hitler came to power, Jewish people set up their own youth group, which they called the Bund. And that by 1935, this had 120 groups with about 9,000 Jewish young people as members. So they responded, taking the initiative, but unfortunately, as with all the other groups, this group of Jewish young people became closed down. And then the big change, the awful change, the sickening change. From 1942 onwards, Jewish children were either sent to ghettos or extermination camps, with an estimated 1.5 million being murdered in Nazi death camps. So that's the experience of Jewish young people under Hitler. Okay, we're going to look at non-Nazi youth groups over and above the ones we've talked about with the Jewish people. Now, if you look at this picture, what you don't see is uniforms. What you don't see are people with smart, short haircuts. What you do see are people in the countryside, boys and girls together, playing music, having fun. This is what some of the non-Hitler youth groups got up to. Okay, and the two main groups we're going to talk about. One is the Edelweiss Pirates, and they had different sorts of names in different towns. The Travelling Dudes, the Navajos, but they're all known as Edelweiss Pirates after the flower badge that many of them wore. Essentially, before the war, what they were doing was just not being part of the Hitler Youth, not wearing uniforms, going on mixed hiking, camping trips, hanging out, just like what most teenagers would do. It has been estimated by some people that up to 5% of youth population of particularly urban Western Germany may have been involved in some way, shape or form with the Edelweiss Pirates. They had a little song, and it's mainly about being free, and they're the fighting Navajos, and about Hitler's gonna get it. And there's also the swing youth, and these basically were people who weren't that bothered about the Hitler Youth, but all they wanted to do was to hang out, listen to jazz and dance. And as late as 1940, over 500 young jazz enthusiasts went to a festival, I think in Cologne, which a Nazi report describes as an appalling sight. Boys and girls jitterbugging with each other. How outrageous. Right, let's move forward in time and look at the impact of World War II on the young people of Germany. The main impact experienced by most young people was evacuation. Rather like in Britain, around 2.8 million children were evacuated from predominantly western areas of Germany to avoid the dangers of Allied bombing, and about 2.8 million were evacuated eastwards. Clearly, for Jewish young people, things were particularly horrific, with Jewish children either being sent to ghettos and then later many to extermination camps, so much so that around 1.5 million were murdered in such camps during the course of the war. What about the Hitler Youth? Well, Hitler Youth, as you can see, this is one of the last known photos of Hitler greeting Hitler Youth, was they started to be used for civil defence. That may be manning anti-aircraft batteries, obviously very bravely. In one event in 1943, one of the anti-aircraft batteries was hit by a bomb and 14 Hitler Youth youngsters were killed. From 1945 onwards, as the manpower resources of the German Reich were failing, they were used as a sort of civil defence home guard to try and keep Germany running. However, there was a dark side to it as well, as some members of the Hitler Youth joined the 12th SS Panzer Division, known as Hitler Youth, who tried to respond to the Allied D-Day invasion, and horrifically, around 156 Canadian soldiers who had surrendered at Ardennes Abbey were massacred, involving some being killed by the Hitler Youth. Moving on, the war also sees active opposition to the Nazis increase. You've probably all heard of the July bomb plot, which doesn't directly, of course, relate to young people. What it does show, however, is that opposition is rising, and Edelweiss pirates are engaged in increasing acts of violence against the Nazis. Small acts of sabotage. There's graffiti. They shelter enemies of the Nazis, escaped prisoners of war, some Jewish people. They raid army camps. They actually kill the head of Gestapo in Cologne, and 13 Edelweiss pirates are executed for that man's assassination. And so the Edelweiss pirates were often seen as a footnote in opposition in World War II, actually should be given a lot more prominence. There's a book came out in the last couple of years, which I'm yet to read, which seems to, if you like, put Edelweiss pirates back in the status that they should have been all along, not as a footnote, but as a major piece of evidence of young people's opposition to the Nazis. And more famously, the White Rose Group, which is a non-violent student resistance in Munich, led by Hans and Sophie Scholl. They published and distributed leaflets that criticised the Nazis. The leaders were arrested and they were executed. So, two main opposition groups. One, perhaps more famous, the Munich White Rose Group, but the Edelweiss pirates should not be underestimated. Okay, so let's move on about looking at how we might answer a question. In what ways are the lives of young people in Germany affected by Nazi policies? It's the 8 marks. And what the examiner's looking for? They're looking for complex, with detailed knowledge, accurate. And you think, oh, I could understand that. But it is simples, people. Simples. Let's focus. Let's get this done. So, talk about more than one sort of change. Okay? So he talks about changes, more than one sort. You could talk about how the Nazis take over education. And then you can talk about how the Nazis take over young people's leisure time. You could talk about how that changes over time. So you could talk how it went with the Nazi youth groups being one of many to being the only one allowed to becoming compulsory. You could also talk about differences over time, about the treatment of Jewish young people, about humiliation, about banning, about being sent to the ghetto, about being exterminated. And you could talk about those groups who are outside Nazi policies, who react, if you like, to the Nazi policies. And there you've got Edelweiss pirates and you've got the White Rose Group. Remember, what the Edelweiss pirates do changes over time. Before the war, they're basically a group of teenagers who don't want to follow what the Nazis are doing, more independent, go out in mixed groups, listen to music, wear what they want, have long hair, all those riotous, troublesome things that teenagers tend to want to do. And then you also get the involvement of the Hitler Youth in war. So differences between groups, how girls and boys were treated differently. So boys focus on physical fitness, about if you like, martial skills, getting ready to fight, and the females being indoctrinated into how to run a good household, how to have lots of lovely Aryan babies, how the Jewish young people were treated, how illegal groups such as Edelweiss pirates and swing youth were treated. Okay, you could talk about the differences. And then you could talk about some specific details and facts. If you're not sure, go vague, people. It's not wrong, it's just not as precise as it could be. So by 1940, over 80% of German youth were part of Nazi organised groups. So clearly, 4-8 marks. You don't need to do all that because you'll be writing a massive essay. But what I would suggest is you should look for at least 2 sorts of difference. How many people? 2. So you could talk about education and youth groups. So education and leisure time. You could then talk about how the experience changed between peacetime and wartime. Or you could talk about how the difference was between those who were involved with and embraced the Nazi system and those who were opposed to it. But only a couple of those. I hope you find that useful. Okay, good luck. Hope the revision's going well. If you want any help or any ask me any questions, either leave a comment in the comment section, amazingly, or get in touch with me at mrbshistory1832@gmail.com. Thank you. Good luck.